I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share what turns out to be a very short summary of the research that we've been working on, specifically looking at how organizational self-diagnoses affect change in gender inequality within the organization. So to set us up here and sort of think about the framework we have in mind, the graphic that I'm showing is not one that surprises most of us. It essentially is showing the relative pay women receive on average vis-a-vis men. So there are so many different drivers for this type of inequality, most recently estimated at about 81 cents on the dollar. The different drivers range from things like women being evaluated differently than men, both in being promoted and in getting performance reviews. And one of the key drivers here is that women often are in just different jobs than men are overall, right? So that comes from women applying for different jobs, pursuing different fields, as well as bias and inequality in the hiring process, where they're potentially disadvantaged for jobs that have historically been held by men. So for all those different factors, we see this level of inequality on average. But a really important thing to keep in mind is that this is not uniform across organizations. So here I'm just highlighting one stylized example of Salesforce. So Mark Benioff, when he found out that Salesforce had pay inequality, he set out to do something about it, right? So there's lots of articles. He now has this book where he's basically trying to take steps to redress the inequality, and the company has invested nearly $9 million in doing so. What they realize is that in order to equalize pay so that men and women in the same jobs were paid equally, they needed to increase pay for a large proportion of their female employees. And they did so in multiple waves, amounting to about $9 million. So this fact, the variation that we see across organizations, where some firms have much more inequality and other firms have less, really served as the motivation for the study. So in this study, what we want to understand is how can we better identify which organizations are likely to make improvement to actually help to redress this inequality. We know that there's variance, there's some sort of examples and illustrations of this, but we don't really know how we predict which firms are going to be able to do this better than others. So the research question we're asking here is exactly to that end. It turns out it's really hard to identify appropriate data to ask this type of question, because essentially what we need to be able to observe is level of inequality over time, as well as indicators at the organizational level that give us some traction in explaining or identifying, predicting that inequality. So in this study, we're leveraging the UK's 2017 Equality Act, where they're focused on gender pay inequality. And specifically what the mandate asks is that every company with 250 employees or more has to report multiple dimensions of pay inequality, specifically showing what proportion do women earn relative to men in terms of base pay and bonus pay. In addition to this required component, firms are also encouraged, or it's recommended, that they include a supporting narrative that explains the current gap, potentially outlines what the company plans to do about it. They have lots of latitude, both in terms of whether they submit this information and if they do, what they include in these documents. So in going through these documents, what we realized is that there was huge variation. Many companies didn't do it at all. And those that did ranged from a paragraph or two, just with a statement about what the gap was resulting from or what they were currently doing in terms of policies and practices, whereas other companies had 15-page documents with illustrations and graphics and additional data. So we leveraged these reports, these narratives, to really try to understand whether just submitting a narrative report, whether engaging in this voluntary action of writing the report, writing this narrative, predicts their ability to actually improve over time. And beyond that, the sort of deeper dive that we do with this data is understanding the content of the report. And are there certain features of the type of narrative that the organization is engaging in that helps us understand whether or not they improve over time? So this is really where the funding that we received from Bernstein came in. So I'm going to take just a moment to tell you what we did in terms of our data process. So the first piece was easy, right? Our dependent variable, the thing we're explaining is this gender pay gap. Companies are reporting this year over year. It's quantitative data that we could just access through the UK's website. Narrative reports, on the other hand, were qualitatively coded, meaning that it started off with Jenna and I working together to come up with a code book of how we wanted to code each of these reports. Finding things like what kinds of commitments are they making? What kinds of policies and statements are they having in place already? And what are they claiming to do in the future? What kinds of attributions or sense making are they engaging in for why they have the gap in the first place? So we started with that process. We then had to hire a team of master's students who had experience with qualitative coding to hand code 1,000 of these reports. And our last step, the piece that we're currently working on now, is having a machine learning, developing a machine learning algorithm to use this qualitative coding to apply those codes to the remaining 5,000 reports. So we're just finishing up that tail end of the process, but it's been a laborious and expensive process. We really just want to stress how helpful it was to have the funding from Bernstein. So I'm going to share a couple of preliminary findings. As I mentioned, we're still in the process of finalizing these machine learning algorithms and finalizing our data, but a couple of interesting things are coming up from the data already. So the first is that, contrary to what we expected, the simple act of submitting this report, of engaging in the writing of this narrative, does not predict a company's reduction of the gap. So it's no more likely that a company who writes a report reduces their pay inequality from 2017 to 2 years later in 2019 than if they hadn't written a report at all. Similarly, we also coded things like how much they invested in the report, how long is it, how many different unique components were included. None of those factors seem to be predictive of their change from 17 to 19. The thing that's really standing out as being the most predictive of the likelihood that they improve is actually whether or not they engage in what we're calling the self-diagnosis process. So for organizations that actually engage in an understanding of what is leading to their gap, specifically and most commonly when they're pointing to the absence of women in top organizational positions, the fact that women tend to be in lower ranking positions, if they engage in that sense-making process and make that attribution, we find that they're significantly more likely to reduce the gap over that 2-year period than if they don't. Again, all things held equal, even if we're comparing similar organizations engaging in other elements of the report similarly. This was really interesting to us because very often what we think about is that organizations are going to make change if they have policies and programs in place. So the first thing we thought about is we have to really account for what kinds of policies are they claiming to engage in. So the effect that we're finding is a net of the actual policies that they're engaging in. So above and beyond having certain programs, simply engaging in this attribution process is really important for understanding whether they make improvement over time. So with that, I'm going to stop and just reiterate again that we really appreciate the support that we received from Bernstein. I'm happy to answer any questions in the remaining time that we have.
So we have about a minute for questions. None came through the chat box, but does anybody would like to raise their hand to ask a quick question? We have about a minute left. Okay. So Mabel, my one question for you is, where do you take this research from here?
So we're at the stage where we're hoping to have the final or the first sort of complete draft of the paper over the next couple of months, month or two. And our goal is to submit it to a sociology outlet. And then from there, think about practical implications and sort of what we can extrapolate from the findings of the study as well.